I watched your interview with Michael Albert and Noam Chomsky.
What did you think of that?
You can imagine what I think. I was a little shocked to hear Michael Albert say PMC. And I'm like, and then I always have to remind myself that that's not just new rhetoric, but that's an old term from Barbara Ehrenreich back in the day from the New Left, right? That's been around for a while, and goes back to a James Burnham idea.
Right. Yeah, I know.
The managerial elite and the managerial revolution.
We got to talk about this in the parrot room because I have things to say that I don't want to say for everybody.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. All right, so Chris Catrone is back. Chris Catrone is a professor in art history, right? And a contrarian, and the former president of Platypus, the Platypus Affiliated Society, and very popular on the Zero Books channel, and the bane of C. Derek Varn's existence. And I'm glad to have you back, Chris. Well, not exactly. Well, along with everybody else, Chris.
Yes,
along
indeed.
with everybody else. I wanted to actually, on that note, before we jump into the essay you wrote, which is about Afghanistan, your essay is entitled Afghanistan After 20 and 40 Years. I believe that's the title, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Before we do that, though, I wanted to bring up a controversy that Derek Varn brought to me about Platypus, and I'm not trying to do a gotcha question right off the start, but it is a gotcha question, maybe. One of your members, and I forget the name of the member, is working for the Claremont Institute, which is a right-wing think tank.
So this is Wyatt Verlin,
right?
And he's a very young man, and it's kind of a college summer internship,
right?
And he went and did his stint, and came back and said very dramatically, the right is even worse than the left.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're even more sectarian and more ridiculous and more absurd and more intellectually narcissistic than the left is. And I thought, well, that's saying something.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
and I said, my response to it, this was at a dinner party of Platypus members. He had just come back, relatively recently from the summer internship. And I said, it might be a problem with intellectuals, right? And intellectuals in politics, that intellectuals treat political issues as like their own sort of ideas and, their own sort of personal property at the level of ideas and ideology. And that is in and of itself problematic. And, and of course, the right in some ways might be even worse than the left in being undisciplined. The right can fall back on the power of the status quo, the power of the existing social relations, and so doesn't really need terribly much any kind of organizational discipline, whereas the left has to have organizational discipline in order to affect reality, because it's trying to change reality. It's not relying upon the power of reality the way the right is. Right.
Well, one of the things about the Claremont Institute that I took note of, and actually Verlin approached me to write for a publication that they were putting out, and I thought it over, and the money just wasn't good enough for me to take the hit. But also... I'm
sure it's just a nominal fee. In other words,
right.
It's like a typical writer's fee for like an article, which is paltry.
Right. It was nothing. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was I had put out a video about Christopher Lasch and the family.
Right.
And I was being asked to write for the Claremont Institute about Christopher Lasch, and I think Christopher Lasch is a contested figure.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a conservative interpretation of Lasch, and there's a left-wing interpretation of Lasch, and the conservative interpretation is winning.
Well, the other thing about the right is that they can kind of make use of anything, right? They're sort of free to appropriate, make use of anything. And, in other words, Marxism has been used by the right. It's called Stalinism.
Right. Right.
No, the truth of the matter is that, Stalinism was a massive capitulation of Marxism to the power of the status quo. You could also say social democracy is that. And Marxist ideas have been used to justify that. So the right can use anything. There's nothing that they can't use because they use it opportunistically. They're not constrained by principle.
Well, I think if you include social democracy as part of the right, then perhaps Christopher Lasch was on the right.
Sure, I think that he was.
Yeah.
I think
in that sense,
he was. Now let's back it up a second, right? So Christopher Lasch is interesting as like a dissenting voice in the era of the New Left,
right?
And the New Left and the New Right are parallel phenomena. You can't really understand one without the other. They both come out of the same thing, which is the crisis of the Democrats' New Deal coalition. And so the New Right, neoconservatives, neoliberals, even the Christian fundamentalists migrated from the New Deal coalition to the Republican Party. They were originally part of the New Deal coalition. And then, have a different kind of edge. Like religious fundamentalism has a different edge, starting in the 60s than it had previously. That's around the world. And, what one could say is that the New Right and the New Left are both phenomena of the breakup of the old capitalist paradigm, the post-war capitalist paradigm. And mostly, the New Right comes out of the Democratic Party. The neolibs and the neocons are, there are different flavors of neoconservatives, of course, but a good portion of them, like a Daniel Patrick Moynihan type is like a kind of a neoliberal and, obviously just a Democrat. And, discontent with the Great Society, discontent with the limitations of the New Deal that were made manifest, and the fraying of the New Deal electoral coalition and its transformation by the inclusion of black voters after the voting rights restrictions were lifted. And so it's a complex phenomenon. Christopher Lasch, though, I read him back in the day. Adolf Reed told me to read Christopher Lasch. I hadn't really heard of Christopher Lasch, and Adolf Reed really promoted him very strongly to me. On narcissism and the agony of the left. Now, Adolf did warn me, well, watch out for a haven in a heartless world and, the true and only heaven, that there is a kind of unmistakable, drift to the right. Although even there are some still left-wing sentiments. And although I'm not terribly, familiar with it off the top of my head, Lasch was also very much concerned with the old Socialist Party of America and its history as a road not taken. So Lasch is interesting. He is. Right-wing thinkers, and this is not to slam him, but if we just say, okay, he makes a kind of a conservative turn, right-wing thinkers are interesting because they can, express things. And, it's a matter of how you take them, right? And so, I think someone like Wyatt, member of Platypus, he is seeking after, and there are a bunch of people seeking after, not in Platypus, outside of Platypus, like the Bellows, some kind of right-left convergence, and I think Angela Nagel, didn't she write for that new kind of Trumpist Hegelian conservative journal, American? I know,
yeah. Okay, I didn't know they were Hegelian.
Very much. They have this thing about the labor ethic. They're very aware of what Hegel's about. They're we need to go back to Hegel because Hegel understood the true basis of the society.
Right.
right? And which he did, right? And so we're just living in a period, the end of neoliberalism, the end of neoconservatism, of ideological realignment. I mean, realignment makes it more coherent than it really is. What it is a sort of exhaustion of the ideology of the preceding 50 years. New left and new right ideology, neoliberal and neoconservative ideology. And, it's going to kind of take on a new configuration, more or less opportunistically, largely based on what the capitalist parties do, right? The intellectuals follow the parties. And, who knows what use they might make of whatever, Lash, Marx, I mean, there was a time when I know that Tucker Carlson's staff was researching me and thinking of having me on, right? Because he likes to have these sort of socialists on, not only to argue against them, but to say, well, if you really meant what you say, if you weren't just a Democrat, I would totally support what you're saying.
Right.
Right. And, which is very confused, of course. But again, Carlson's not held to any kind of scruples.
No, he's an opportunist like anybody else on the right.
On the right. And the opportunist doesn't mean I'm sure that he thinks that he's very principled.
Right.
Right. And so opportunist, it's a measure with regard to capitalism. Right. In other words, it's a very peculiar Marxist notion of opportunism. It's not just sort of rank scrupulousness or something. It's just these people at a very fundamental level accept capitalism. They do. And that goes for a lot of nominally anti-capitalist people too.
Oh, almost all of them. Almost all of them, including me on some days, right? It's hard.
Capitalism, right?
Yeah. So, I want to get to the questions about your essay. But I'm going to do that in just a second. But one more aside, and then maybe we can pick up this thread in the parrot room. But when you talk about conservatism and the desire for some sort of mixing of left-wing principles and conservative ideas, or another path that wouldn't be captured by the Democrats. That what I thought of was my first, or the Republicans, or the Republicans. What I thought of was my first novel, which was about May 1968, and I had Christopher Robin Milne end up in Paris in May 1968. He would have been 38 years old. So the kid from Christopher Robin's, Winnie the Pooh stories. And I had read his biographies, and he became someone who really prided himself on being a mature humanist and naturalist. And he owned a bookstore. He had to struggle to kind of overcome, it wasn't the only thing that defined him, but he had to struggle to overcome being defined by his childhood and being perceived by his schoolmates as this, kid with long hair and short trousers and all. But he fought in the Second World War in Italy, and he was so he's a serious person. And I wanted to take him and put him in May 1968 and see if I could imagine what he would find valuable in May of 1968. What would still redeem
when
what
were you
was
writing
up.
This?
This was 2011, so it was a while ago.
What did you imagine would be?
I imagined the impulse to overcome. First of all, the one of the other characters was someone who could see the past in the present, sort of a magical realist type character, so he could see how the past had led up to this moment, and he could even, through some sort of vision, sometimes intervene or change things a bit. So what he found valuable and necessary was to change the terms of society, because he was alienated from the life he was living, alienated from modernity, and maybe in a kind of conservative way, maybe even. But like the trash in the river, the kinds of books that he was being asked to sell, the way people were approaching sex in the new sex manuals, all of it. His own autistic child, which was an invention of mine, but he had a disabled daughter, and I gave him an autistic son
Mm-hmm.
instead.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all the reasons why he could relate to the students in the streets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
Discontent with capitalism.
yeah, but
Absolutely.
the conclusion of the book is like his wife, they're back in the UK, they're back in their bookstore. It's turned out to be more like a family vacation than a life-changing event. The old reality is coming back, and his wife says something to him like, they tore up the cobblestones, but we can see from across the river there's an old fortress, and they didn't have anything that they wanted to defend the way we used to. There was not a way of life that they were wanting to defend. It was all, they just thought if they tore up the cobblestones, they could spend their days on the beach with, French starlets and in bikinis and stuff. It was a beach of bikinis and not the beach of the beachhead of a battle for a real change.
Right.
So that was the conclusion of the book. And now that I've said it here, I've realized, why did I have to write a whole novel to say that? But in any case, the point is, I think that maturity and conservatism are often conflated. An understanding of the limits of life and the necessity to build rather than just destroy.
Right. So I think that there are some things that the old socialist movement and old Marxism took for granted, which is that this is not adolescent nihilism, right?
Right.
That this is the serious business of transforming society, and transformation means continuity and change. And while the actual change that is likely to result from overcoming capitalism will be profound, we're not necessarily motivated to achieve it for just the sake of change, for the sake of profound radical change for its own sake or something.
Right.
In other words, one of the reasons why Second International Marxism seems so conservative to people is that it accepted the bourgeois common sense of the working class. Right? And while it was sympathetic to the nihilists of the time, the anarchists, the propaganda of the deed, in Russia, the Narodniks, sympathetic, still, it was like, that's not the way forward. Right? And, now I think that that's all that there is. Right? There's just this kind of nihilism. And, nihilism doesn't mean not believing in anything. We're not talking about like philosophical nihilism. We're talking about political nihilism. And political nihilism is a kind of rejection of everything that exists in terms of it being irredeemably corrupted and culpable in the status quo and its balefulness, And so I think, Trotsky in the Russian Revolution, his history of the Russian Revolution, the 1917 Revolution, he says that the conservatism of the masses is the main driver of the revolution. And, it's a similar insight that Freud had in Civilization and Its Discontents, which is, when do you have a revolution? You have a revolution when the subaltern, the people who believe in the ruling values of the society, see the ruling class betraying those values. That's when they overthrow them. Right? In other words, you're not going to get the masses to make a revolution on the basis of some bohemian, wholly new utopian vision of society. No. Right? The masses are going to rebel to save society against the depredations and corruption and follies of the ruling class that has delegitimated itself.
Yeah.
Right? So, that's just reality, right? And so, we have to think about what we're trying to do politically here. Now, it is the case that keeping the flame alive of radical transformation does rely on kind of utopians and maybe some bohemian intellectual types. There's a role for them. I mean, it's the merger formula. It's Kautsky, that Lenin subscribed to, that old style Marxism was based on, and people like Eugene Debs in the United States, adhered to, which is the unification of the socialist intelligentsia with the workers' movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And, the socialist intelligentsia was meant to discipline itself to the task of building up the working class into a political force that could take power. In other words, to play the necessary coordinator role. I watched your interview with Michael Albert and Noam Chomsky.
What did you think of that?
You can imagine what I think. So,
right. How did I do? No, what? We'll talk about that in the parrot room. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, you did fine. I thought that you pressed them well. I thought that was good. But, the big boogeyman for them is the coordinator class. That It's not good enough to replace the 1% over the 99% with 20% over 80%. Right? That's not good enough if you want to eliminate class society. Now, of course, the point is the goal is not the elimination of class society. That's going to be a byproduct. The goal is to overcome capitalism. Right. And so, anyway, there is this coordinator class. I mean, 20%, that sounds like a hell of a lot of people. I'm not sure. Does that mean that your dentist is a member of the coordinator class? That's not right. So anyway, but there's going to be a role for the so-called, managerial, right? Because, I was a little shocked to hear Michael Albert say PMC. And I'm like, and then I always have to remind myself that that's not just new rhetoric, but that's an old term from Barbara Ehrenreich back in the day from the New Left, right? That's been around for a while, and goes back to a James Burnham idea.
Right. Yeah, I know.
The managerial elite and the managerial revolution.
We got to talk about this in the parrot room because I have things to say that I don't want to say for everybody. And because I really want to work with Michael, and I feel like he's a really nice guy. And if I can figure out how to get him to open up, we could have some fruitful
look,
debates.
I'm not just bothered by them, by Michael Albert and Noam Chomsky. I'm not. And in some ways, I'm more bothered by Noam Chomsky than by Michael Albert because of the different public political role that Chomsky has to play, right? And that he plays very deliberately. Michael Albert is more, of an intellectual and, and less given to rhetorical concessions. And so anyway, I mean, obviously I don't like their attack on Marxism. I don't like the Bakuninite attack on Marxism, and I don't like the vilification of Lenin and of the Russian Revolution. I think that that's all just very wrong and quite pernicious because, I think that it's a real big obstacle to starting a socialist party, which we need. And so, and again, they just see the Socialist Party as some device for the coordinator class, controlling the working class. And it's actually supposed to be the opposite, right? I mean, insofar as it became that, that is a phenomenon of failure and defeat. Now, it is, look, I'll just admit, it's an open question. The reason that the coordinator class argument is plausible is that the historical jury is still out on the viability of Marxism. And in some ways, the verdicts come in. Marxism failed. And it did turn out to be kind of this bureaucratic whatever, right? Domination of the workers, whether through social democracy or through Stalinism. In other words, it doesn't have to be Stalinism. It doesn't have to be the Gulag. It can just be the SPD. It can be the Socialist Party of France. It can be the Labor Party. Yeah,
listen, I really do want to come back to this in the parrot room because I think there's a lot of juicy. So let's go. So let's talk about your essay. Look, I thought your essay, which again was Afghanistan after 20 and 40 years, it seemed to me to be a warning to the left to hold off on considering the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan as a victory for the left and to be wary of the urge to embrace defeatism, or the idea that any loss to the U.S. military power and prestige would be a victory for socialism. Would that be at least part of what you are arguing?
That is true. And of course, part of that is because there is no socialism, right?
Right.
So in other words, if there were a significant socialist party, then perhaps any defeat by the U.S. at the hands of whomever, the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong, the Taliban, whomever, might be some kind of weakening vis-a-vis, a socialist movement of the ruling class, right? So if there were a socialist party, revolutionary defeatism, really defensism, though. I don't know. Now we're getting into some very esoteric stuff. Go
ahead and explain the difference. What's the difference? What is defeatism and what is defensism?
Defeatism is more about inter-imperialist warfare, right? So if the U.S. went to war with the EU tomorrow, then socialists in the U.S. and in the EU would both be obligated to be defeatists. Defensists are, we want to defend Afghanistan against the imperialists.
Right.
Just straight up, right? And which is different, right? In other words, it goes beyond defeatism. It's really defensism, meaning that socialists in Afghanistan would fight to defend Afghanistan.
Right.
Right? Wouldn't want the defeat of the Taliban, I guess. Mm-hmm. Right? And, but the era that those programs came from was different. I was reminded recently of the film Reds by Warren Beatty.
Yeah.
And if you recall, he's alienated from the Third International on a trip to a conference that's held in it might be Baku. I don't know if it's the Baku Congress or not. But he's alienated by the Allahu Akbar and the death to, U.S. and the burning of Uncle Sam in effigy by these Muslims, right? And I was thinking, okay, it's about Iran, actually. It's about the Iranian Revolution, which is contemporaneous with the film being made. Mm-hmm. And, but... So it's very much preoccupied with its own moment and not really about the past. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking about, the original Red-Green alliance, if you will. The Greens being the Muslims, right? At the Third International, being in favor of the rising of the Muslim world against colonial imperialism. Mm-hmm. And, does that mean that communists supported Islamists? No. Right. However, right, any more than communists or Marxists would support secular nationalists either, and so-called left nationalists. Right. So there is a difference between defensism, defeatism, support. Right. Now, the real issue is, what's the alternative to the United States in the world?
Right.
So, and also, it's not even about the alternative to the United States, right? So, in Afghanistan,
well, I want to jump here and ask a question to clarify what you mean by that. So, the one of the problems that I experienced as part of the anti-war movement in early days was that there was an abdication of being political. It was direct, there was a vote. We are not a political organization. We're not going to be critiquing or suggesting policies. We are a pacifist organization decrying war on the basis of that, on the basis of the necessity for peace. Uh-huh. So a moral stance was all that the people thought they could take at first. But what that meant was not only that they couldn't conceive of a strategy for intervening to stop the war that would be powerful enough to actually succeed or even attempt such a thing. They couldn't even lobby. Right. But they
as a self-limitation.
Right. As a self-limitation. But also it meant that they couldn't understand why the war was happening because there was no motive for political thinking.
This is after 9/11?
This is after 9/11.
Uh-huh.
This is 2002. This is right around the time of the invasion of Afghanistan, right before and after.
Mm-hmm.
And look, it was understandable in that moment as to why people were behaving in a cowardly way, because the sentiment in the street, even amongst people who were supposedly on the left, was that we absolutely had to invade Afghanistan or defend ourselves, and this was not Vietnam, and we could not, if you were against the invasion of Afghanistan at that moment, like I remember getting chased out, or not really chased out, but yelled at in a hippie coffee shop by a guy with long hair and, who looked like he would have been an ally, but who was not. He told me I was a traitor and a terrorist sympathizer, and for saying, come to our peace rally against the invasion of Afghanistan.
I mean, let me say something.
But the point I'm making is they cannot. So we have to ask the question now, 20 years out, what was America doing after 9/11? What it was, and how does its role that you were about to discuss, how does that inform
the United States,
why it did what it did, and what is it doing now?
Right. So, in my article, I mentioned Adolph Reed, and I haven't been able to dig up the article in which he wrote this. It's either in the Nation or the Progressive, but I did find a reference to it in another article, in the New York Observer of all places, kind of a catty article about the left in Afghanistan from 2001, from October of 2001. So Adolf, said, well, of course we're against all imperialist adventures, but the workers aren't going to understand being against, doing something about 9/11, right? So he said, it should be limited to a police action,
right,
going after those who are responsible. And, it shouldn't be allowed to turn into a new crusade on the war on terror, which of course it was inevitably going to be. And so, and I thought at the time, well, this is a little bit lame, because it's kind of like, okay, you're supporting the war on conditions, of your own political conditions, and nobody's listening to you. So it doesn't matter. And I mean, nobody's listening to the left anyway. But let's back it up a second to the moral issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, pacifism is problematic because it's moralistic. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, on the one hand, what I want to say is two things that will appear to contradict each other. I want to say pacifism is a legitimate position, which is that all war is illegitimate, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, right? On the other hand, and the point of the matter is that capitalist politicians will also talk about war being illegitimate and being only a necessary evil. On the other hand, on a moral level, right, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda deserved what it got from the United States. But also the United States on a moral level deserved to be defeated by the Taliban.
Right. Well, so so on a moral level at the time, what I talked about when I talked about things on a moral level was the people in Afghanistan who were already suffering from a famine and who needed aid just to survive, who were now having that aid disrupted and having their lives even further disrupted by bombs that weren't going to do anything to protect the United States from future terrorist attacks, I didn't think, but only make conditions worse there.
Oh, no. I mean, the tactics of the Taliban are really execrable.
Hold on one second, Chris.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm recording a podcast. What's up? Okay, well, go on the other side. My kid.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I was going to say about, the tactics of the Taliban are execrable, and the tactics of the United States are if anything, as bad. Maybe not as bad, at least in, ostensible purpose, but in actual fact. So, okay, about, humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention, right? My former comrades, the Spartacists. So they said something about the Haitian earthquake back in the day. The big earthquake that Haiti's been suffering from ever since, even though they've had things in between. About the U.S. going in on a humanitarian mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, they cited Trotsky's article from the 1930s, Learn to Think, where Trotsky said, well, 90 times out of 100, or maybe 99 times out of 100, we're going to be opposed to what the bourgeoisie does. But 10 out of 100 times, or 1 out of 100 times, we're going to actually support what they're doing. In other words, we're against the police and we're against the state, but we're not against firemen putting out a fire. Right? And so the Spartacists were like, well, you know, insofar as the United States has the largest portable desalination plant, namely a U.S. aircraft carrier, available to provide drinkable water to people who are the victims of an earthquake, how can you oppose the U.S. Navy and Marines going in and giving water to Haitians after an earthquake? You can't. Now, what's interesting is, soon after that, they printed a retraction. And they said, this was our August 4th moment in which we crossed the class line and betrayed the working class and the people of Haiti to U.S. imperialism. And so we should have been U.S. out, no matter what. I think the first perspective was right? Now, of course, the humanitarian aid doesn't come without the guns.
Right.
That's also true here. Right? In other words, if there's a natural disaster in the United States, the National Guard is going to be there, and they're going to be distributing food and water and whatnot, medical supplies, and they're going to be providing services. But they're also going to shoot people if need be.
Right.
Right? So, you know, again, it's like we have to be careful about all this. I think that a real socialist party would oppose everything that the government does, or at least criticize it. In other words, would say, you know, that's the least you could do, but you know, you did it really poorly and you could do it much better, but we don't expect you to do it any better, and the point is to overthrow you because you're never gonna do the right thing, really. You know, you're only going to do the right thing kind of by accident. And which doesn't mean that there aren't well-intentioned people, but it does mean that objectively conditions are such that even well-intentioned people are constrained by circumstance to not ever be able to really do the right thing, or what's called for and what's possible, really, you know, in terms of like the potential for socialism. Now, that kind of unremitting oppositional stance has filtered down through the generations to us today, right? So people today, they look back on, like, you know, Lenin and Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg and August Bebel, not one man or one dime for this rotten system, right? And they think, oh, I just want to adopt that attitude today. And it's like, but that attitude was premised on a real, tangible, concrete political possibility of overthrowing capitalism and achieving socialism that doesn't exist today. And so now the very same like position and analysis and reasoning just feeds into what would otherwise, you know, in their time had been anarchist or neurotic kind of nihilism, right?
Right.
And that, you know, trusted the spontaneity of the people, you know, that you blow up this society and people in their innate goodness will just reconstitute it better. And, you know, there's a kernel of truth to that, but no, right? In other words, the Marxist vision is that the working class has to be organized to be able to take over society. It's not,
you have to remember
right?
that the people are who constituted this society.
They are.
That's the thing you have to remember. Like,
that's their liability and it's their advantage.
Yeah. But I mean, it's not as though we're trying to free all the people of the earth from an alien invasion. No, we're freeing all the people of Earth from the society that they built in this haphazard.
Well, here's the third worldism, right? Here's the third worldism. Because I think that people do imagine that the left is trying to free the people from an alien invasion, whether that's capitalists or white people or white straight male patriarchy, settler colonialism, the West, all this crap, right? And it's like, well, no. Right, so that kind of third worldism, which is really what we inherit from the new left. I
mean, the smart for third worldism is not that, but it's that we are looking for the most radical, militant, progressive parts of the working class, and we believe they're going to be in the third world. Isn't that the smart version of it?
It might claim to be that, but in practice, it liquidated to support for third world nationalists.
Right.
Right. In other words, capitalism.
Yeah.
And so, I rag on Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, in my article, because I'm like, okay, we're dealing with a whole generation of kids now raised on this crap.
Right.
Right. Oh, the U.S. was founded on colonial settler violence and slavery and genocide. And, that's what it's built on. And it's like, no, the United States is built on the labor of the working class.
Right.
Including enslaved people, including colonized people, including people who were victims of genocide.
Right.
Right. In other words, and the idea, I mean, of course, this sounds fanciful to people, but the idea is that there is a working class that would include free white settler colonialist workers, enslaved people, and people who were subject to genocidal violence. That all together, that's the working class.
That's a lot. The last one's the hardest to grasp because you'd have to show that how that their annihilation fed into or created the working class.
We all die.
Yeah, but
we do all die.
Yeah, I know. Right? I'm just saying, like,
we're built on
was that part of basically the enclosure of America, basically for capital, is how you would say that?
It's basically like, look, obviously, genocide is just not redeemable, right? In any way whatsoever, and was not necessary in any way, at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Neither was chattel slavery necessary for capitalism. It was possible for it, but it was not necessary. No.
Marx said something a little bit different. He said that without chattel slavery, European capitalist development would never have occurred at least at the rate that it did, that it was reliant.
The rate that it did. Okay. So, and that's the tricky part. And you could also say that a big factor in the dissolution of traditional social relations in Europe was the influx of cheap silver and gold out of the mines of the Western Hemisphere, right? The primitive accumulation of capital, right? Obviously gave a huge spurt to the growth of capitalism. I mean, really bourgeois social relations, right? But then again, so did the Black Plague.
Right.
The Black Plague also gave a big spurt to the growth of bourgeois social relations in Europe. So, but again, I mean, the disappearance of the Native Americans. I hate to say this, but even in the United States, a lot of white people are of Native American descent. Yeah. They just are, right? In other words, like the Native Americans disappeared. They were absorbed by the white and black population, right? A lot of blacks have Native American ancestry as well. And so we are, the working class is the inheritor of the vanquished of history, and including those who disappeared quietly, right? In other words, and peacefully, like not quietly and violently in the sense that no one recorded the horrors. A lot of the horrors are unrecorded, but less dramatically. And okay, right now the reason it becomes like third worldism and postmodernism and like cultural imperialism, all this stuff. It's like, look, I'm Chris Catrone living in the United States in 2021. Where's my Irish culture? Where's my Italian culture? It's gone. It's replaced by Hollywood culture industry bullshit.
That's on The Sopranos, right? The Italian culture.
Yeah, exactly. Or like Andrew Cuomo or something, right? Like pisses everyone, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not that Italian. Right. And so, I mean, my family, it's funny, like my parents, like everyone else would kiss. Not my family, not my immediate family, because I think that my parents wanted to be more white than that. Yeah. I mean, whatever. So, so cultural imperialism, sure. Who's not a victim of it? right? In other words, the liquidation of culture. Culture is wiped out. And, I just have to say, culture? Why are we defending it? What's to defend about it? Like, in other words, I'm a gay person. Traditional culture is just not good.
Right.
I don't mourn its passing at all for anybody. For anybody. And now you could say, well, my family, immigrants, like, they chose to give up their culture as opposed to others who were forced to give up their culture. Why did they come here? Out of economic compulsion, right? Because if they stayed in Italy and Ireland, they would have starved to death.
Right.
Right.
Okay, I have a question about your essay. I'm going to go to here because I think it might help. It might clarify some things. So, in your essay, you wrote that Fred Holiday, after 9/11, asked who was responsible for the terrorist attack, and he answered that it was the U.S. itself, along with its allies, Saudi Arabia and et cetera. Not in the literal sense of like 9/11 being an inside job. Actually, did read what you wrote, 9/11 truthers, but rather in the profounder way that the U.S. nurtured radical Islamic terrorism in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union and its local secular nationalist Afghan allies in the 1970s and 80s. But then you write, but the chickens coming home to roost were not Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, but rather the left itself. It was the legacy of the 20th century's left, whose price was to be paid now.
Mm-hmm.
There's an exacting cost to history. So my question is, how was the left, maybe the American left, culpable or implicated in the attacks of 9/11? How were those attacks the cost of the left's historical failure?
I would say, and this is why we were just talking about it, that it's the long slide into third worldism, but also second worldism. In other words, it was the abdication. And what that means is it's not like we shouldn't be sympathetic to the struggles of the third world or even of the second world, but the abdication of the struggle for socialism in the first world and in the United States above all.
And when did that start? To really, how did we abdicate that responsibility? Was it after World War II?
It started in 1924 when Stalin said there's not going to be a revolution in Germany.
Right. Yeah.
That's when it started. And, in other words, all the decisions made by the communist movement after that point were predicated on that assumption. Now, thinking third worldists will answer, well, what are leftists in the third world supposed to do? Wait for revolution in the West? Well, it's not like I'm saying you have to wait for revolution in the West. World history at an objective level is saying you have to wait for revolution in the West. In other words, it's not like a choice. Are we just sitting on our hands waiting for revolution in the West or not? It's circumstances are such you are waiting for revolution in the West, and not just waiting. Maybe you can contribute to it. I mean, after all, there is, and there always has been, a migratory working class in the world, right? And so, socialists from Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, I've met them. They come to the U.S. They should help us organize a socialist party here. They should take their experience, skills, and contribute to making revolution in the United States. Right? So I'm not going to blame
What about the struggles for just better living conditions that naturally arise in the third world amongst the working class? What about those kinds of movements?
Yeah, those kinds of struggles are extremely important. I don't think we should expect great things from them any more than we should expect great things from reform struggles here in the United States. Right? In other words, of course people should fight. Of course. But let's be realistic. But
that isn't socialism.
Right. Let's be realistic about what it is, right? In other words, and maybe in the United States and in the rest of the world, maybe you do need to be like a Marxist socialist to fight for basic reforms. Maybe you do, right? To fight for them, really fight for them. In other words, to fight for them on the ground level in civil society, to wrest concessions from the capitalists and the landlords and whomever, regardless of what the law is, regardless of what government policy is. Right? In other words, a lot can be achieved without changing a single thing about government administrative policy or legislation. A lot can be changed in reality on the ground, regardless of who's in power. Right? I mean, there were Marxists who were fighting under the Nazis, living under the Nazis. They still continued to fight.
Right.
Are we really going to claim that somehow we can't fight until the Democrats pass this or that legislation? What?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you again something that came up earlier. Why did the United States go into Afghanistan after 9/11? What and how did it relate to the United States' unique role in the world to kind of give order to capitalist relations and be the enforcer?
Right. So it's a complicated question because of course they went in to get Al Qaeda and, exact revenge and prevent another 9/11, right? Of course they did that. Why did they stay?
Well, I mean, look, Adolf Reed's proposal of a police action would have been more effective and
Isn't that
more
what
efficient.
It was? The United Nations authorized it.
Yeah, that's what they but it wasn't but like a police action,
and NATO
where
per se.
Taliban offered to turn over bin Laden before the bombs started dropping. A police action, like police, like you're investigating a crime, not like police action like in Vietnam, but like coordinated with international bodies to round up the specific terrorists responsible, perhaps even cooperating with the Taliban diplomatically.
Sure.
That would have been a much more effective way of actually dealing with Al Qaeda than dropping bombs on Afghanistan.
I mean, you and I have talked about this previously, and, really, I have not researched again the circumstances. I think that the Taliban, and I could be wrong, but I think that Taliban temporized and refused ultimately to turn over Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. They may not have been able to anyway, and probably there was some disagreement among them about doing so. Maybe they did want to do it, and the U.S. attacked anyway, right? Like I'm not sure exactly about the details of it.
That was what I thought at the time. And now that the invasion is, over and we're withdrawing, it is what mainstream, people, relatively mainstream people like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi are saying.
They're saying that the U.S. didn't give them a chance to turn them over. Yeah,
that there was an offer, and that was reported in like the Washington Post right before the invasion.
Well, right. So it's a question of so let's bracket that because I'm not sure.
Right.
Actually,
I'm just saying like something other than an invasion with the nation building as the ultimate, as a long-term goal, and ground troops on the ground, that could have been done and might have been more efficient.
Let's bring in the neocons then, shall we?
Okay. Yeah.
So basically, and I have to say that I'm very irritated endlessly by the idea that the project for a new American century formulated in the 1990s was somehow greenlit and implemented as a result of 9/11. It was not, because the project for a new American century was not about the U.S. invading countries. It was not, right? Mm-hmm. It was about the soft power. And so, like that kind of left demagogy about that stuff. The seamless transition between like anti-WTO activism into like anti-war on terror activism. There's a lot of fudging involved in that. So let's talk about the neocons, because I'm not sure the project for a new American century is really neocon. It's neoliberal as much as it's neocon. It's Madeleine Albright. It's Democrats. It's not just Republicans. Right. And so what did they want to do, the neocons? They wanted to eliminate the conditions under which Afghanistan could be used as a platform for international terrorism. Right? In other words, you're getting ready to use a Kamala Harris expression. You're not just dealing with the problem, but with its root causes. Right? Let's deal with the root causes. And so the root causes is that Afghanistan had fallen apart, was essentially a failed state, and that if it hadn't been a failed state, the Taliban wouldn't have taken it over to begin with.
Right.
In any way, large parts of the country were controlled by opponents of the Taliban, the Northern
Alliance.
Blah, blah, blah. Right? So let's overthrow the Taliban, they thought, and let's get rid of the root causes for the 9/11 attack. Now, did they expect to establish a liberal democracy? Of course not. Not really. But a more stable regime, right, more responsible to the world community. And frankly, this is how they got everybody on board. It wasn't just bleeding heartism for the victims in New York, right? It was
freeing the women in Afghanistan.
Oh, please. Oh,
but that was part of it.
I know.
Right?
That's just credulity. That's just ugly naivete. I mean, that's just, please.
I know.
Now, I mean, maybe in Kabul.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, a lot of emigre Afghan capitalists came back after the overthrow of the Taliban. You know, they came back with a kind of more secular social and political agenda for Afghanistan, right? Under the protection of the United States, you know, as part of this nation-building effort. And, you know, they were not able to hold the country together any better than they were under Soviet intervention, right? Because obviously the Soviets intervened on behalf of native Afghan, like, reformers, social reformers, secular nationalist type people, right? Basically capitalist developers, I would say, right? So then the question is, okay, well, was it a mistake or not? Because that's what the capitalists are thinking. You know, they're thinking, okay, it was reasonable to have tried, right, to do something about Afghanistan and not just about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We tried and we failed and we learned our lesson and now it's time to come home. That's Biden. And, you know, and Biden, you know, is claiming, and maybe rightfully so, that he knew from the beginning that you can't do this, that you can't really nation build.
Yeah.
Right? When he was in the Senate or whatever. Maybe he knew that. I mean, he is the Vietnam generation. Maybe they know that, actually. Maybe Trump knows that. He's the Vietnam generation too, and Trump would always say that the worst mistake that the U.S. ever made was the war on terror, and the second worst mistake was the Vietnam War. That's what he says, right? So that generation, I mean, you know, look, they are attuned to, you don't want to, like, get into a quagmire. You don't want to try to do something that's not really possible, right? And certainly if you try and fail, you cut your losses, right? You don't keep bleeding forever. So, I mean, I think, though, that the U.S. looking at Afghanistan was looking at Pakistan, India, Russia, China, Iran. In other words, it was really looking at the fact that, you know, India and China have gone into shooting wars, including relatively recently. Russia and China have had shooting wars too. Soviet Union and China. They had little, you know, these crazy frontier skirmishes over, like, the tundra, you know, or in the Himalayas. Like, you know, it's kind of like, what do you make of that? Well, wait a second, though. India and Pakistan and China and Russia are nuclear-armed countries.
Yeah, I know.
You really don't want shooting wars, right?
One of my earliest short stories was about the nuclear Armageddon, and it started between India and Pakistan. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely, right? And so now, you know, I'm reminded of my Indian and Pakistani friends who say, well, why does Pakistan want to control Afghanistan? So there's a reason. It's called strategic depth. That's the term that they use, meaning that they want someplace that their military can retreat to if India invades them. Why does India want to control Afghanistan? To prevent the Pakistanis from having a place to retreat to if they invade Pakistan.
Right.
So, you know, this is very real. It's very real. In other words, it's active strategic planning by nuclear-armed militaries who have their sights set on each other right now.
Right.
Right? What is the U.S. interest in that? Preventing any of that from happening. The U.S. is interested in preventing that from happening. The U.S. does not want India and Pakistan to go to war, does not want India and China to go to war. Right?
Right.
Doesn't want Russia and China to go to war. They also don't want them to cooperate against the United States, but they also don't want them to go to war.
Right.
The U.S. does not want war. It does not. Right? So here's the other myth. That the U.S. are these warmongers, who are just out to, like, kindle any conflict and start any war, No. Not at all. So that's the other problem. Now, so we live in a world where wars are going to happen. They're going to happen because of capitalism, not because of interested parties. Of course there are interested parties. There are war profiteers and whatever. But the weapons manufacturers, they make money whether you shoot the guns or not, right? Mm-hmm. Especially in the United States. I mean, come on. The United States keeps the arms manufacturers happy. You don't have to go to war to line their pockets.
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
Right? So, the bottom line is the United States does not want war.
Right. But it's very hard to sell a ground war to the American public on the basis of holding off a war between India and Pakistan.
Is it a ground war? In other words, they knocked out the Taliban and then they occupied the country and they bled a little bit. I mean, they didn't suffer, the U.S. military didn't suffer casualties in Afghanistan the way they did in Iraq.
Right.
They didn't. Right. In terms of the ongoing occupation. Right. So in Iraq, they were suffering just a lot more. Right.
Right.
And, so.
But nonetheless, it would have been, obviously going after Al Qaeda was a reason given to the American public, and holding and
preventing
securing.
another 9/11.
Yeah. Right. And securing some sort of precarious balance of conflict in
the American
the Middle
public
East.
Doesn't care about that, but they should. In other words, look, the elite, the technocrats, the Obamas, the Bidens, the Hillary Clintons, who are like, WikiLeaks should not reveal our email correspondence because the public doesn't understand, right? And the public should just leave it to us. Our decisions are the right ones. We're the informed people. We know what we're doing. So American public, please just go about your business. Don't pay too much attention to what we're doing. We know what we're doing. Mm-hmm. Right?
It's like the IT guy who comes to fix your computer. It's like he doesn't want to explain how it works.
What they really believe.
Right.
When they negotiated the trade deals, Obama, with Europe and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, written into those deals, the Obama administration, there was a secrecy clause. They said to the other governments, you are not allowed to reveal the details of this treaty because the public will not understand and it will be subject to right-wing demagoguery both in your country and in our country. And so if you sign this treaty, you are forbidden from revealing the details of our agreement. Right? Mm-hmm. And, it might even be rational. Yeah, you don't want right-wing demagoguery. You don't want things taken the wrong way. Do people need to know the details? I guess not. Now, but that is their attitude. That really is their attitude. And, as it turns out, they make mistakes. As it turns out, they're not so competent. Now, is it because they're incompetent, or is it because of an intractable capitalist condition, that you can just manage the chaos, more or less, and often less?
I tend to think the second thing is true.
Right?
Yeah.
And socialists are strong.
But back to the left, and the problem at the beginning of after 9/11 was that the left wasn't aware of didn't allow itself to be aware of just what the managers were even trying to do.
Yeah,
right.
They made up
right.
lies about it instead. It's a
Right.
new Christian crusade. It's
Mm-hmm.
Islamophobia. It's like, if the U.S. wanted to launch an anti-Muslim global crusade, it wouldn't look like the war on terror.
Right.
It would be
it's clearly not Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Because George Bush was one of the people who was leading the crusade against Islamophobia.
And because, look, the fact of the matter
Islamophobia is all about, that kind of rhetoric is all about the people hate each other. Internally, the domestic population hates each other, and the native population can't be trusted to act civilized after, right?
But even so, like after 9/11, there was some anti-Muslim violence.
Oh, yeah.
On the part of civilians and on the part of the authorities. The police did things like set them up, like create terror cells out of like hapless Muslim immigrants, and
right. But all that stuff about capturing Islamic people and taking away their rights and throwing them in prison. Yeah, that all happened, but that wasn't anti-Islam. It happened, but it was also like just very much a continuity of Bill Clinton's war on terror,
sure, they did,
and war
already.
On civil liberties, and
they did that already.
And we can see now it's aimed at the domestic population.
Yeah,
not on a huge scale, but in a way that's serious, I think. So we have to wonder about the future of bourgeois rights in the United States under both parties. We have to wonder about.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that yes, socialists would stand for the civil liberties of Muslims and others against, would stand for the civil liberties of fringe right-wing people from being abused by the government.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In other words, on principle. Right?
Right.
You don't want the police setting people up. Right?
Right. And you don't want people being held indefinitely in detention without charges and being judged in the courts of public opinion, which happened to, like, I don't know, it was like the Portland Six or something. These Islamic immigrants that may have had some tenuous connection to, and were probably FBI, probably FBI informants set them up to begin with, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
What people have to understand is that, you create an anti-terrorism unit in the FBI or in the local police department. And then people's careers are dependent on them showing results, and they'll make it up just to be able to say, "I did something. Right. Give me a raise. Give me a promotion."
There was a Christmas tree bombing plot, that involved like 7, like here in Portland, involved like 7 FBI agents and 1 teenager.
Right, and so it's just a bureaucratic logic, and it's awful. Right, and so that's why the war on terror should have been opposed per se. On principle. Now, would there have been a world in which there wasn't a war on terror after 9/11? Probably not. Right. In other words, this is what the government does. It tries to do these things, and of course, along the way, it tries to, it spreads its mission creep. It sort of metastasizes. It starts taking on other problems that could be, in some plausible way connected with the original mandate. But again, really, Afghanistan, it was wrong from the standpoint of a socialist left. It was a mistake from the standpoint of the capitalists and their politicians, right? Mm-hmm. And, the other thing about the bureaucracy, so not only do they promote themselves through these things, but also people compete with each other within the bureaucracy. And so, it's almost like Tsarist Russia, where, like, one group of police are setting up like a terrorist attack that another group of police doesn't know about, and shit happens, right? People botch things on purpose to make their competitors look bad so that they can get the promotion instead of someone else. They undermine each other. And meanwhile, the population is the victim. of this.
Well, you said something in your essay about how Chomsky didn't think that the war in Vietnam was a loss for the United States, but a long-term victory. And you kind of suggest something might also be true about Afghanistan. It seems to me that if you think of it in terms of the necessity to attempt to police the world and maintain some sort of unbalanced balance around the world through various kinds of actions, then, the Afghanistan invasion and occupation was ultimately a failure, but not a mistake. Like, or like, just like
They
if you're
could turn
treating a
it
patient,
into some kind of success. So
like if you're treating someone who has cancer and you use techniques to hold off the cancer for 6 months, but then they die. Well, you held it off for 6 months.
That's considered
right?
a success. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And in Afghanistan, you had 20 years of occupation. Okay, and now things are turning back into chaos, but we'll come up with something else now. But look, that treatment worked for a long time.
That's what some of them are saying. They're saying, well, at least we prevented another 9/11 attack for 20 years.
Right.
And, I think maybe even beyond that, if the Taliban want to stay in power, maybe they're not going to let ISIS and Al-Qaeda operate in Afghanistan.
Right. Right.
I mean, that's at least a possibility if they want to stay in power. Right?
Yeah.
Again, it's the question of overreach. Hindsight is 20/20. And so would the U.S. have done better to deal with these things at a distance rather than through occupation? Right? And so, will they do a smarter war on terror, drone strikes forever? Like, starting under Obama and continuing under Trump, that's what it became. It became less boots on the ground and more drone strikes. And, which is less of a risk to the United States, less of a liability. It's kind of invisible. It just goes on without the media really covering it or anyone really hearing about it. That's a possibility. Can they work through proxies? The problem with working through proxies is that, of course, the proxies have more connection to local powers than they do to the United States. Right? So the Northern Alliance was Russia and India, basically. The Taliban are Pakistan and maybe China. Maybe. And maybe China will pacify Afghanistan better than the United States was able to do because Pakistan depends on China to keep India at bay. It's this kind of stuff, and it really is a kind of deeply opaque and ugly world, right? Of, moral ambiguity, certainly political ambiguity, geopolitical ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And, so, again, the left should be cognizant of this reality. Right. In other words, it shouldn't. I guess there's a kind of propaganda point of saying the U.S. is responsible for everything. Sure, in some way you could say that. In another way, though, responsible for what? Responsible for every little crime that takes place in the developing world? Not really. Responsible for suppressing socialism in the United States? Definitely.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.